Welcome to the Commercial Edge podcast with me, Chris Webber. Come and enjoy a virtual coffee while I share my experience and ideas that could help you overcome difficult people at work. I share my thinking and insights so that you can find new ways to overcome challenges and gain a commercial edge and unleash the power of people. This week's podcast is going to focus on gossip and people who gossip at work. I've got a couple of things to talk about. Talk about gossip as a poison for the culture that you work in, the damage that gossip has on business planning, how we feel about it and what emotions come up from gossiping. I want to talk a bit about the history of gossip, where it came from, and the value that it brings to community. And then I'm going to finish by talking about controlling the narrative and some tips to manage secrets and make sure that you don't have to worry as much about gossiping. So let's start about talking about gossip as a poison for culture. I know quite a lot of people who struggle with the idea of gossip around the office. They get really frustrated by rumours, innuendo, by the divisions that it's caused. And having to manage gossiping, having to manage politics as they see it, becomes an incredibly frustrating part of their job. And it's seen as a distraction. They they're trying to stop people from gossiping about others around their business, around their team, around their organization. And they see it as a problem because gossip, as far as they're concerned, creates tension and silos. It divides people across their organization. And most of all, it becomes a frustration because it distracts you from what they see as being the most important part of the business, about doing the job that you need to do. So let's think about the damage that it does to things like business planning. Now, I've been involved in many reorganizations across businesses over the years, both as a manager trying to lead them and an employee who is uh, affected by reorganization. And as soon as there is a whisper that there's going to be a restructure and a reorganization, the gossiping starts. Who's involved? What's going to happen? Who's heard what from the leadership? And all of this stuff creates barriers to implementing change because there are a set of beliefs that are associated with it. The team starts talking about what's going on, why it's going on, what the business is trying to do, who's affected, who's not affected, leaders and the conspiracy about how they're managing what's happening and who they want in their team and who's going to be affected by the restructure. It just gets filled by gossip and innuendo. And the impact is that it reduces how effective any reorganizations, any restructures can be, any strategies can be. Because what you're finding is that it's just full of conspiracy theories, that rumors spread, gossip spreads about what's going on, and it's not true, it's invented, and it becomes a damage. It comes from the fact that people start to spot managers going into meetings. So, oh, I noticed, leader of this department meeting with such a buddy from that department. I wonder what's going on there. There must be something happening. They see days blocked out, strategy days for leadership. They come across a report that's open on a desk that they're looking at, or a consultancy has been seen coming into the business, and we all know what that means, that there's going to be sort of restructure, reorganizations. And it comes from the fact that there are little tidbits of knowledge that then get put together and can become incredibly damaging. It makes it almost impossible for leaders to truly get into some strategic thinking, to scenario plan. Imagine that they've got one scenario and a second scenario, and they're working through the detail of each. If rumours come out, how would you feel when you start to reflect on, well, this one means certain implications. Well, if that rumor gets spreads out, then people are going to be thinking that's what's the decision that's going to be made. Not necessarily the case. These become barriers and problems when you're trying to really think about the business and what the strategy is for the future and how you're going to make change happen. This is why rumor, why gossip is seen as such a poison across organizations. And it leads to incredibly powerful emotions across the team. I know people who feel incredibly victimized by gossiping. How does it feel when you hear somebody who has told a story about you? Um, you feel out of control, a loss of control, because what other people are saying about you is not necessarily true. And you can't control what they're saying. You find yourself responding and firefighting to rumor and innuendo and gossip, and you lose that sense of control. And I've already talked about managers who feel frustrated for the time that's wasted in the business trying to put an end to gossip, trying to stop rumors from spreading, trying to control what is being said. And ultimately, you can result in a culture and a team which is just full of rejection, loss of confidence, people who feel like they're an outsider because they're not part of a gossip group. It just reminds me of an episode of Friends, if anybody's rewatching Friends from decades ago, where Rachel eh, decides to start smoking because the people who go smoking have this opportunity to gossip and share information, and she feels outside. And so she begins smoking at work to get in with that group. And I know that feeling. You know, I've been in meetings and conferences where there's a group of people who go outside and they create this little clique of people in the know, sharing little bits of information, especially across teams and departments. And I think that's a good example of how rejection can come from this sense of rumor and gossip and people feeling like they're on the outside of something which they should feel part of. And gossiping is not new. And looking up the history of gossip, because I feel gossip is very much something we see associated with celebrity, that we have celebrity gossip columns. And, you know, I think when you start to look at it, gossip is everywhere. We see TV shows focused on gossip, innuendo about what's happening on a movie, what's who's married to who, what's going on in their personal lives. Instagram, Facebook, news feeds are full of I've heard this about somebody, I've heard that about somebody, feeding that. The oldest reference I could find was a series of articles in the London magazine in 1777 by a guy called James Boswell. And he wrote a series of 50 articles about gossip, about what's happening in London society at that point. And when I then started to really think about it, what I realised was that news articles are mostly gossip. There are some reporting of facts. So this happened yesterday. You know, a politician made a statement to the press. Everything after that becomes rumor gossip. So the reporter and the journalist makes their money from having spoken to someone in the who works for that government department, and they've got some quotes, some comments, some things that they've heard, some rumors that are floating around. They share their opinion about stuff, and that is a big part of news that we see as serious news. So we can't escape gossip. It's so central to who we are. It's so central to our social lives. It's everything. And when you start to research the history of gossip, there's a strong belief that sees it as being a central part of how we build our communities, how we build our culture. Chimps share grooming and they spend time brushing each other's hair, finding ticks, finding lice, and cleaning each other. And it's really well known that that's a very important part of their personal connections, building alliances, building connections. And there's a theory that our communication around gossip is a big part of something similar happening in human culture. We are not hermits. We live in groups and communities, and the role of gossip could be a really important one. Some people suggest that even our language has evolved to mimic gossip. Structure of a sentence is a subject, so a person, a task or a verb, an action, what they were doing, and an object, who they were doing it to. And it's really hard for us to think of sentences that aren't that way. And when we communicate, we create a personality on almost everything, as if it is a gossip, if it is a story about somebody. And so there's a strength in feeling that we are effectively gossip. We do gossip, and that it plays a really important role in the community. So, for example, people think that it's a way of sharing community rules. So if there's a piece of gossip about somebody and it's suggesting that their behaviour is not in line with what the community would anticipate, what the community might expect, then that comes with a sense of judgment. That people say, oh, that's not great behaviour, they shouldn't be doing that. And by sharing the story and the opinion, we're creating rules for other people to follow. That we recognise, oh, if I do that, it's likely I'm going to be talked about. It's likely that this is going to be judged badly by other people in my peer group. And so we're creating these unwritten rules about how we behave, and by sharing gossip about people in the community. There's also a belief that we learn about people from our network by gossiping. So someone telling you a story about what someone did, what someone else has done, gives you an insight to who that person is, what they do, how they behave, how they think. And that's a really helpful piece, because we cannot actively manage a lot of communications. We can live in a group of about 100 people. As it starts to get bigger, we struggle to maintain the networks, but our actual active group is much smaller. And we rely on informal communication as a way of keeping up to date with what's happening in the wider part of our community. And so sharing stories, hearing gossip about other people keeps us in touch with an extended part of our network. It can introduce us to people. I would often write a message to somebody if I'm being introduced and connected and say, I've heard a lot about you. I heard a lot of good things about you. I'm using gossip and conversation tidbits as a way of introducing myself and connecting to somebody that I have never met before. So it does play an important role. And there's a final part of it, which is that if we know something that other people in our networks don't know, it gives us a sense of importance, gives us power. We are more important because of what we know. And and so there's some status associated, especially if this information is privileged somehow. That the fact I know this information means that I'm connected to the people in authority, I'm connected to the people in power, and I'm associated with them through this information. And so there are three really good reasons why gossip plays a very central role in our communities and in our networks. And if that's the case, then you can understand why it exists in the office, why it exists in work, because it's no different. Work is a another example of how we create connections and build communities. So if you think about the role of gossiping and why we do it at work, well, it creates your culture. It establishes behavioral norms. And we are the stories that we tell about people, the examples of good behavior that we share with others. You know, somebody did something amazing. Or I heard this is what somebody did in a meeting the other day and it went down really well. They become the benchmarks that other people will imitate, even if they weren't there. Being judged badly. You know, you heard somebody was in trouble with the boss. You know, I've just heard that Johnny's got in trouble with the boss. Why? Well, because he did this, he did that, he did the other. That's gossip. But what you're sharing are rules about what your boss expects, what your boss anticipates about the behavior. And so it allows us to create consistency across a wide group of people in the office. It's a tool for teaching, it's a tool for learning. But the difficulty is it's a tool that is a little bit indiscriminate because leaders just don't get to own the gossip. They don't get to tell people what the gossip is. It becomes self generating. And certain things become very attractive to gossips. Secrets. Anything that seems to be hidden becomes a great opportunity for gossiping. Negativity, so poor behavior, spreads so quickly because we love those little stories of someone who's got into trouble um, and things haven't gone well for them. Um, but also great moments. We do share stories of someone who's done something amazing and something outstanding. So you can see that it becomes self generating and self attractive, which is hard for leaders to control as a tool. So, how do you control the narrative? Because there are so many negative things associated with gossip and rumour that we do need to think about how do we control this? And there's a sense that people are going to speak. You know, if you know that gossip is going to exist, then getting ahead of it and thinking about what they're going to say becomes very important. So if you know that secrecy is going to trigger gossip and speculation, then reducing that level of secrecy and controlling what people know means that it either could become much less interesting and less worthy of talking about, or they're going to talk about the things that you want them to talk about. And communication experts focus a lot on creating the topics that people want to talk about. You know, there's no doubt there are celebrities in the world who are only successful because people talk about them. That is how they make money. They then get offered TV shows and adverts because they are someone who is spoken about, and that becomes their brand. So, is your brand what you want it to be? There's a good example. I remember King Charles now. Um, he had a terrible reputation across the UK. His wife, Diana, Princess of Wales, was much beloved across the UK. She did amazing things for children. She did a lot of charity work. She did some things around HIV, the minings in that were left in Africa. Some real stuff where she was seen as really courageous and really connecting with people. And when they split up and when they were divorcing, it was him who was painted as the villain, and the way he supposedly treated her was seen as a real negative. He was accused of having an affair with Camilla, of cheating on this wonderful lady, the Diana, Princess of Wales, with this lady, the Camilla. And it became a real negative thing. And lots of people were talking about the fact that he should abdicate He shouldn't be made king. It should go to the next generation. He wasn't worthy of being the king. That Camilla shouldn't play a role in the royal family because we didn't want her there. Um, the wedding that they had was very low key considering his status in the royal family. It was seen as being something we need to keep quiet. And so there was a big problem around what people were saying about, at the time, Prince Charles. And his team decided that they needed to change this. They wanted to get ahead of the narrative. And so they started to think about what does he stand for and how do we control what is being said about him. There are certain things that are important to him. The environment is very important. He's a big advocate of farming, organic farming, and agriculture, and things like sustainability, renewable fuels. He started to do TV appearances, he started to do interviews. They started to give access to his farms and his places of home, conversations with him and his sons, trying to just change what is said about him and what people believe about him. And it's been very successful. He is now seen in a completely different light. There are still people who see what he did and how he treated Diana as a negative, but overall, the impression of him is very different now. And I think that's a great example of controlling the narrative. Him staying out of the public eye and saying nothing allowed people to say what they wanted, to criticize him, to infer how he behaves in private and what he does. When he stepped away, came into the limelight and controlled what was said, he became in charge of what was being talked about, and that gave him much more predictable views of what's going to happen. So, if you want to control the narrative, you need to think about how you control the empty spaces. If you are doing a business restructure, if you're reorganizing the organization and you are going to have a series of meetings, that will be noticed by people in your team. They will see what's happening. They see meetings in calendars. They can see which rooms you go to. They can see consultancies arriving, and they'll create their own stories. If you give them nothing, they will fill it. It's much better to give them something that is true and concrete. So don't allow empty spaces. Manage information and you manage the gossips. So, what sort of tips might I give you to get away from gossips? Well, try not to keep secrets. I know it's very tempting. You're trying to respect other people's privacy. If you're dealing with some performance issues or some behavioral issues in the organization, you want to keep it quiet, you want to keep it secret. But the truth is, you're not helping yourself. Imagine a situation where there's someone in the organization who has behaved very poorly, and certain people have been a victim of that. Now, there'll be rumours circulating about what happened. Nobody might not know the truth, but there'll be rumours about, oh, this behaviour was very inappropriate. Yeah, they're horrible, they're unkind, they're isolationist, they're a bully, all of those kind of things. And then they leave. What people are going to start to say is either they left or it was covered up. Management covered it up. They didn't deal with it because they couldn't deal with it and they quietly brushed it under the carpet. If the truth is that you as a management team got together, you pulled that person in, you did an investigation, and as a result of that investigation, they left the business, then that is something to celebrate. You have taken a positive step in your culture to deal with inappropriate behavior. So, in the same way that court cases are public, and you can protect names and details, you can do the same thing in an organization. So you could say that there have been some allegations of inappropriate behavior and bullying across the organization, and we as a business, as a management team, we actively investigate these. We're not going to talk about who's involved, we're not going to talk about what's happening, but we are investigating these things. And afterwards, you can then talk to your teams and colleagues and say, oh, there was found to be no fault, and so therefore we expect behavior to be go back to normal. There should be no carryover. We've investigated it. It needs to carry on as normal because there were no problems. If there were problems, you can then say we investigated and we found that there were problems, and as a result of the investigation, somebody has now made the decision to leave the organization. And you're celebrating the fact that you're dealing with poor behavior. Yes, there are rules about what you can say and can't say, and that's what I'm encouraging is to understand what the rules are, but not to say nothing, because if you say nothing, you are fueling rumour and innuendo, you are fueling gossip. The secret itself creates the negativity. You're creating the fuel of what are people saying, and you're not in control of that. So make clear what's happening and what you're prepared to say and what you're not prepared to say. If you're doing something like a restructure, it's a classic situation where gossip will abound. So think about being proactive. We are reviewing strategies. We're exploring a whole range of scenarios in order to be effective and in line with the future. I know a couple of people in HR who say, be open with it, because as long as the decisions you're making are in line with a published strategy, no one is going to be surprised. And you might say that it's, we're being very careful about who we involve in this because it's sensitive, because people's jobs are affected. Would you like to hear that your job has been axed from one of your colleagues in a rumour? No. So don't. Control that by saying to people, we are being careful about how we manage information. And as a result of that, we're going to be respectful of people and their roles, but we are exploring efficiencies and changes of strategy to be dynamic in our marketplace. And the final thing is to be proactive when you hear rumours. If you hear rumours that are being circulated around your team, get your team together. Be proactive in dealing with these gossips and these conversations. Don't allow it to be negative. Get ahead of the conversation. Be open and transparent as much as you can, but equally be respectful of this. Talk about the fact that negativity is not where you want to be in the business, that you will want to be positive, that you want to think about pulling things together and owning conversations and fueling positive things. So these are positive behaviors we want to share across the organization. These are behaviors that we want to discourage across the organization. The more you fuel that conversation, the more you're going to avoid issues of these little gossips that become little toxic elements. We cannot get away from gossip. It is part of community and part of life. We've lost a lot. When people are working from home and they're not connecting with their colleagues, they're not having those shared coffees and shared lunches where they have the opportunity to chat. When we're just meeting online, these meetings are very formal. You lose the opportunity to really allow communication with people. And it is not a negative, it is a positive. It helps people to bond. One of the important elements of getting your team to connect and communicate with each other, getting people face to face, is the opportunity to gossip. You just need to make sure that it's a positive thing. Make sure it's a productive thing, because you are missing out on a positive, productive work culture if you try to kill all gossip. It's never going to happen. Just find ways to get ahead of it. Thanks for listening to the Commercial Edge podcast. I'll be back soon with another episode. Join me then when we delve into more difficult conversations. See you next time.